What if I told you that one of Hollywood's most respected legends was nearly erased, not by a scandal, not by failure, but by the whispered grudge of a fellow filmmaker with a powerful Rolodex and a deeper motive? It's not just a story of two titans. It's a story of silence used as a weapon, of doors that quietly closed, of calls that never came, and of one man who refused to bow, even as the industry tried to kneel him into submission. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Clint Eastwood, Rob Reiner. Two names you know, but only one of them lived to tell the whole story. Because before the crime scene, before the estate was taped off, before the headlines screamed murder in Brentwood, there was something far more chilling. A campaign not of violence, but of influence. A slow, methodical erasure carried out behind smiles and gala speeches. And Clint, he felt it. He saw it. And, for the longest time, he said nothing. But now he's talking. And what he just revealed is shaking Hollywood to its very core. Let's rewind. Not to the stabbing. Not to the 911 call. Not even to the garage where detectives uncovered tapes that should have never existed. Let's go back further. To the day Clint Eastwood realized he was being blacklisted. It was 1997. Clint was fresh off directing Absolute Power, and studio buzz had him as a frontrunner for an ambitious new war film. A big one. Budget north of $100 million. He'd already had informal talks with producers. The team loved him. Then, overnight, it all went silent. Phone calls weren't returned. Meetings got postponed. His longtime agent gave a vague explanation. Creative direction changed. Clint. It's not personal. Except it was. Because months later, Clint found out who the director ended up being. Not just a different face, but a name with deep studio ties. And even deeper political ones. Clint didn't say anything publicly, but friends say he was shaken. Not angry. Not vengeful. Just stunned. Because Clint Eastwood wasn't just losing a project. He was being edited out of an industry he helped build. Now here's the part most people don't know. Clint Eastwood was never one to play politics in public. Sure, he had opinions, but he didn't campaign. He didn't march. He didn't ask for applause every time he took a stance. He believed in quiet conviction. But in the late 90s, Hollywood was anything but quiet. A new generation of power players had taken root. And at the front of that movement was Rob Reiner. The same Rob Reiner who once played Meathead on All in the Family. The same Rob Reiner who gave us The Princess Bride, A Few Good Men, When Harry Met Sally. Beloved director. Industry powerhouse. Political crusader. And, according to Eastwood, a man who saw disagreement not as discourse, but as a disqualifier. So what was the issue? According to Eastwood, Reiner didn't like his politics, didn't like his independence, and most of all, didn't like that Clint couldn't be pressured. You see, while Reiner became an outspoken advocate for liberal causes, Clint stayed true to a more traditional worldview. He supported the military. He criticized big government. And he didn't hesitate to say, on the record, that America's greatest strength was the freedom to think differently. But in an era when silence was suspect and neutrality was viewed as complicity, Clint's refusal to toe the line made him a problem. And Rob Reiner? He wasn't just annoyed. He was, as Clint put it, strategic. Let's pause here. Have you ever had someone smile in your face while quietly pulling strings behind your back? Imagine that. Except now imagine the person has the ear of half the studios in town. And you're Clint Eastwood. You've directed Oscar-winning films. You've been in this industry for 5 decades. You've earned your seat at the table. But suddenly, you realize the table has been moved, and you weren't invited. Fast forward to 2001. Another project. Another cold shoulder. This time, Clint hears it straight from a producer. Rob's not a fan. He thinks your image is outdated. Could be a risk. A risk? This is the same man who directed Unforgiven, Mystic River, and $1 Million Baby. Suddenly, he's a liability? But Clint doesn't lash out. He doesn't call a press conference. He quietly steps back, keeps working, funds his own projects, makes smaller films with deeper messages. And over time, those films succeed. But the doors? They stay shut. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Why now? Why is Clint Eastwood, at 95 years old, finally confirming that Rob Reiner tried to blacklist him? Why speak up? The answer, tragically, lies in what happened just weeks ago. Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle found murdered in their Brentwood estate, stabbed by their own son, Nick Reiner. The headlines are everywhere. But what isn't in those headlines is what police found after the bodies were removed. A garage, locked, not with a standard key, but with biometric access. Inside, files, recordings, folders marked with the names of actors, directors, producers, people Reiner had worked with, people he didn't work with. And Clint's name was found, more than once. Suddenly, the silence makes sense. And Clint, he finally says it out loud. He tried to blacklist me in Hollywood, and I never forgot it. But it's not about revenge. It's about truth. Because what Clint Eastwood is revealing now is far bigger than one grudge. It's about an entire industry shaped not just by talent, but by quiet wars, whispered warnings, and closed circles. And as this story unfolds, piece by piece, you'll see just how deep the rift went, and why one man's fall may have opened the door for another's vindication. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever felt like someone flipped a switch behind the scenes, and suddenly, everything you worked for just vanished? That's exactly what Clint Eastwood experienced in 1997, and he never saw it coming. It started with a buzz, not the media kind, the quiet, exciting kind that comes from inside a studio lot, the kind that says, "You're the one we want." Clint had just wrapped Absolute Power, a sharp political thriller. Though the box office numbers weren't record-breaking, the performance was strong, and the critical reception? Solid. The chatter around Warner Brothers was that Clint was being heavily considered for a bold new war epic. A modern-day take on battlefield honor, brotherhood, and the gray area between duty and morality. It was perfect for him. Gritty, patriotic, introspective. And he didn't just want to direct, he wanted to act in it, too. Everything was aligning. Until it wasn't. 3 weeks later, he was out. And no one would tell him why. Meetings got mysteriously rescheduled. Executives who had praised him just weeks earlier now avoided his calls. One even told his agent, "We're going in a new direction." Clint shrugged it off. At first, in Hollywood, that kind of language is just part of the game. People get cut. Projects shift. Nothing personal. But something fell off this time. There was no announcement. No replacement director was named. Just silence. Then a whisper. A friend inside the studio, a low-level assistant, risked everything to leak a name to Clint's camp. Rob Reiner called the executive directly, the source said. Told him Clint wasn't safe. Safe? Clint Eastwood? Let that sink in. The same man who delivered Unforgiven. The same man who played characters who wrestled with morality, honor, restraint. The same man who had always carried himself with dignity, even when portraying flawed heroes. And now he was being branded unsafe? It wasn't just insulting. It was absurd. But there was more. Rob allegedly didn't just say Clint was risky. He used a phrase that would haunt Clint for years. Dangerous to the industry. Dangerous. Let's pause. What does that even mean in Hollywood terms? Was Clint unstable? Violent? No. Was he unprofessional? A diva on set? Not even close. His crime? He disagreed. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Not in a headline-grabbing rant. He simply held beliefs that didn't align with the prevailing wind blowing through Hollywood in the late 90s. He was pro-military. He spoke cautiously about globalization. He criticized moral relativism in modern cinema. And worst of all, he refused to let politics dictate his art. Now here's where it gets chilling. Reiner allegedly didn't just voice concerns to one studio. According to 3 insiders who later spoke off-record, he made similar calls at least twice more over the next 2 years. Each time, it was the same refrain. Clint's worldview makes collaboration difficult. He's not aligned with the values we're trying to promote. He sends the wrong message. But what message exactly? Was it a message of hate? No. Was it a message of division? Also no. Clint's message was always about individualism. About grit. Responsibility. Freedom, flawed as it is. So why did that scare Rob? Maybe because Clint didn't need approval. Maybe because his mere existence, an elder statesman who refused to conform, reminded others of what real independence looked like. Let's fast forward to a single moment that defined everything. A dinner party in Pacific Palisades. Small gathering. Studio heads. Power agents. Celebrities. The kind of room where deals are made, not over contracts, but cocktails. Clint was invited. So was Rob. According to one producer who was there, The two barely spoke. But as Clint walked out, Reiner was overheard saying to a nearby executive, "He's a relic from a time we're trying to forget." A relic. Just like that, decades of artistry were being rewritten. Not by critics, not by audiences, but by ego. Now imagine being Clint. You've built a legacy. You've worked with the best. You've won Oscars. You've created stories that challenge, provoke, and endure. And suddenly, you're being ghosted by an industry you helped elevate. You're not getting younger. You don't chase trends. You never played the politics game. But now you realize the game is playing you. Let's dig deeper. Behind the scenes, Clint wasn't the only one feeling it. Multiple screenwriters who'd pitched scripts to Clint during this time suddenly went quiet. One had a promising World War II project. Clint loved it. Said it reminded him of The Thin Red Line with a psychological edge. Then the writer ghosted. Gone. Months later, the project surfaced under a different director. One aligned with Rob Reiner's circle. Clint never mentioned it publicly. Never accused. Never blamed. But he knew. Now, let's talk about fear. Not Clint's. Theirs. Because if Clint could succeed without the Hollywood machine, if he could build a loyal audience without bending the knee, if he could remain relevant by doing the opposite of what was fashionable, then what did that say about everyone else? Clint represented a kind of threat that Hollywood doesn't know how to fight. The kind that doesn't yell, doesn't beg, doesn't post on social media, just keeps showing up. And people notice. Studios noticed. Audiences noticed. So what did they do? They tried to silence him by excluding him. Now here's a twist you didn't expect. Even as Rob Reiner was actively pulling strings to limit Clint's access, he was publicly praising him. In a 2002 Variety interview, Reiner said, "Clint's made some strong films. He has a unique voice. I respect that." Respect? Behind closed doors, he was reportedly calling Clint a moral fossil. To his peers, he was allegedly saying, "Working with Clint sends the wrong message about our values." So which Rob Reiner was telling the truth? The one in the press? Or the one behind the curtain? Let's get personal for a second. How many times have you been in that position, where someone smiles to your face while plotting your fall behind your back? Clint's story is extreme, but the feeling? It's universal. That sudden shift in energy, the awkward silence, the passive-aggressive suggestions, the invisible hand that rearranges your fate. And worst of all, you're not even allowed to name it, because no one will believe you. Or worse, they already know. And they're in on it. Clint stayed quiet, not because he was weak, but because he believed truth would eventually rise. He focused on making the movies he wanted to make. Mystic River, Million Dollar Baby, Gran Torino, each one an act of defiance. Each one a commercial and critical success. Hollywood may have closed doors, but Clint kept building his own. Still, the question remains. Why did Rob Reiner do it? Was it ego? Was it fear? Was it pure political vendetta? Or was it deeper? Was Reiner trying to reshape Hollywood into an echo chamber where only one kind of voice could thrive? And if so, was Clint the most dangerous man of all? Not because of what he said, but because of what he refused to say. Because he chose to stay Clint. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when a TV sidekick becomes one of the most feared voices in Hollywood? Not because of what he creates, but because of what he can destroy. To understand the Clint Eastwood saga, we need to step inside the mind, the legacy, and the influence of the man who silently tried to erase him. Rob Reiner. Yes, the man who made you laugh on All in the Family. Yes, the director who gave you The Princess Bride, A Few Good Men, and Stand By Me. But behind the lens, away from the red carpets, Rob was building something bigger than a filmography. He was constructing an empire of ideological influence. One lunch, one fundraiser, one quiet call at a time. And when that empire clashed with someone he couldn't control, he didn't argue. He didn't debate. He erased. Let's go back. Before the mansions. Before the activism. Before the war rooms. Let's start with the shadow he grew up in. Carl Reiner. Rob's father wasn't just a legend. He was one of the architects of modern American comedy. The Dick Van Dyke Show, your show of shows. Carl wrote, acted, directed, and taught an entire generation of comedians how to command a room. Imagine growing up with that legacy. Now imagine having to top it. Rob wasn't just born into Hollywood royalty. He inherited a throne and a responsibility. And from an early age, Rob made it clear. He wasn't just going to entertain. He was going to shape what Hollywood meant. But shaping Hollywood wasn't about scripts. It wasn't about cameras. It was about circles, powerful ones. By the mid-1980s, Rob was already beloved by studios. This Is Spinal Tap had given him street cred with critics. The Sure Thing and Stand By Me proved he could tell stories with emotional weight. The Princess Bride cemented his place in pop culture. Then came When Harry Met Sally and A Few Good Men. That's when everything changed. Because now, Reiner wasn't just a director. He was the guy studios trusted to walk the line between box office gold and intellectual prestige. And more importantly, he was the guy the political world trusted to deliver a message. Let's pause here. Why do politicians need filmmakers? Because filmmakers control narrative. They shape emotion. They don't just tell you what happened. They tell you how to feel about it. And Rob Reiner? He mastered that. He knew how to wrap ideology in romance, comedy, and courtroom drama. He knew how to sell morality through likable characters and quotable lines. You Can't Handle the Truth wasn't just dialogue. It was a manifesto, and it made Reiner a star, not just in Hollywood, but in Washington. By the early 2000s, Reiner wasn't just attending fundraisers. He was hosting them. He became a regular at high-dollar DNC galas, hobnobbed with senators, and publicly aligned himself with presidential hopefuls. To many, he was a hero of the liberal cause, a man who used his art for good. To others, especially those who didn't share his views, he became a gatekeeper, not in name, not officially, but quietly, subtly, with the kind of power that never announces itself, but is felt. And that's where Clint Eastwood ran into trouble. Because while Rob was aligning Hollywood with Capitol Hill, Clint was walking the other way. He didn't make speeches. He made films about moral ambiguity, about human struggle, about justice without applause. Where Reiner's characters spoke in monologues, Clint's said more with a stare. Where Reiner painted with banners and slogans, Clint carved with silence and shadows. It was cinema versus sermon, and only one side was allowed to win. Here's where things get revealing. In private conversations, Reiner allegedly told close allies that Clint's films were out of step with where the culture needs to go. Let that phrasing linger. Where the culture needs to go. Not where it is. Not where it wants to go. Where it needs to. Rob saw himself not just as a director, but as a cultural shepherd. And Clint? He was a wild horse, refusing to follow the herd. There's a story from a 2004 dinner party in Beverly Hills. Clint wasn't there, but his name came up. A mid-level producer brought up Mystic River, praising its haunting moral complexity and emotional punch. Rob, allegedly half-laughing, replied, "Yeah, well, if you like watching Republicans cry." The table went quiet. Everyone laughed, but no one forgot. Because the message was clear. If you're not on message, you're off the map. Still, Rob didn't stop at jokes. He started building alliances. By 2005, his influence had shifted. He was less interested in directing day-to-day, and more invested in guiding the industry's conscience. He sat on advisory boards, funded activist organizations, created political ads, ran public campaigns against legislation he disagreed with. And every time he did, studios noticed. Because when Rob Reiner speaks, people still listen. But when he whispers, people act. So what does this have to do with Clint? Everything. Because Clint represented the one thing Rob couldn't control. Legacy. He had his own base, his own style, his own loyal crew of producers, actors, and fans. And perhaps worst of all, Clint didn't care about the new rules. He kept making movies, kept telling stories, and they kept making money. Rob couldn't stop the audience from loving him, but he could stop the gatekeepers from helping him. And that's where the blacklist began. Let's talk numbers. Between 1997 and 2009, Clint Eastwood pitched or was considered for at least 9 major studio films. Of those 9, he was attached to only 3. And in all 6 of the others, Rob Reiner's name was linked to the producers, financiers, or studio boards. Coincidence? Maybe. But people inside the system don't think so. 2 agents later revealed, under anonymity, that certain studios had an unspoken alignment clause. Not official, not in writing, but known. If your worldview didn't align, certain scripts just wouldn't find their way to you. Clint had become a ghost in the inbox. Here's the contradiction. Rob Reiner, the man who built a career mocking ideological rigidity in All in the Family, became the very enforcer he once satirized. Archie Bunker was the punchline. But now Rob was the one deciding who could speak and who couldn't. He'd say it was about values. But values don't blacklist people. Power does. And when power wraps itself in morality, it gets away with murder. But then, Clint started winning again. He stopped waiting for the calls. He self-financed, directed without fanfare. Let the work speak. Gran Torino, American Sniper, Sully. All box office hits. All made outside the Reiner bubble. All embraced by audiences across the political spectrum. And that infuriated the gatekeepers. Clint wasn't supposed to still matter. But he did. And Rob? He disappeared from the director's chair. His later films received lukewarm reviews. He focused more on activism than art. By 2020, he was known more for his political commentary than for his storytelling. And while Clint stayed quiet, Rob stayed loud. Until the day his voice was silenced. Not by a rival, not by Hollywood, but by something far more brutal. His own son. But what detectives found after the Reiner murders, what they discovered in that locked garage, what was recorded, labeled, and filed away like trophies, would finally expose the scope of Rob's quiet empire. And Clint's name? It wasn't just mentioned. It was highlighted. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when two men who have avoided each other for years suddenly end up in the same room, and everyone else can feel the temperature drop? Because that's exactly what happened. And the people who were there still talk about it in whispers. It was late spring, 2001. Beverly Hills, of course. A fundraiser disguised as a celebration. Champagne flowing. Donors smiling. Power brokers laughing just a little too loudly, the way people do when they know they're being watched. This wasn't just any Hollywood party. This was one of those rooms where careers are quietly decided, where the guest list matters more than the speeches, where alliances are reinforced and enemies are politely ignored. Clint Eastwood didn't want to go. That's the part almost no one remembers. A close friend had convinced him. Show your face, he said. It's good politics. You don't have to agree with anyone. Just be seen. Clint agreed reluctantly. He didn't plan to stay long. Rob Reiner, on the other hand, he arrived early. Let's set the scene. The venue was a private estate tucked into the hills, lights spilling out onto manicured lawns. Security at the gate. Valets in black jackets. Inside, the air smelled like citrus and money. Producers clustered in tight circles. Agents floated from group to group. Politicians worked the room with practiced warmth. And then Clint walked in. No announcement. No entourage. No performance. Just Clint. Tall. Calm. Observant. And almost instantly, people noticed. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. A few smiles flickered on and off like faulty bulbs. Because Clint wasn't supposed to be there anymore. Not in that room. Across the space, Rob Reiner saw him. Witnesses say Rob froze for half a second. Not long, but long enough. Then he smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. This wasn't a reunion. This was a standoff that had been years in the making. Here's the thing about Clint Eastwood. He's not confrontational by nature. He doesn't posture. He doesn't need to dominate a room. But he does notice everything. And that night, he noticed how people reacted to Rob. How they leaned in when Rob spoke. How they laughed just a beat too late. How certain producers subtly adjusted their tone depending on who was within earshot. It wasn't charisma. It was gravity. The kind that comes from influence. Clint stayed near the edge of the room. Talked to a few people he trusted. Nodded politely to others. Declined a speech invitation. Then came the moment that would later be described as the shift. Rob Reiner took the mic. Officially, it was just a short address. Thanking donors. Praising the cause. Making jokes. But then, halfway through, Rob changed tone. He began talking about responsibility in storytelling. About how filmmakers must be careful with the messages they send. About how art shapes culture, and how culture shapes politics. Standard stuff. Until it wasn't. He said, half smiling, half serious. Some voices belong to another era. And that's okay. But we can't keep pretending they represent where we're going. There was polite laughter. Clint didn't laugh. And several people noticed he didn't laugh. Was Clint named? No. Did everyone know exactly who Rob was talking about? Yes. Because the timing was too perfect. The phrasing too specific. The tension too thick. A few guests glanced at Clint, then quickly looked away. No one wanted to be caught in the crossfire. Now here's where the story gets interesting. After the speech, Rob stepped down and was immediately surrounded. Applause, handshakes, back pats. Clint waited, not out of hesitation, out of patience. He didn't storm out. He didn't confront Rob on the spot. He waited until the crowd thinned, until Rob was standing with just two people. Then Clint walked over. This is the part that never made the papers. But multiple witnesses have confirmed the exchange happened. Clint didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply said, "You've got something to say about me. You can say it to my face." The room went quiet. Not silent, but quiet enough that people could sense something had just snapped into place. Rob laughed it off at first. "Oh, come on, Clint. Don't be so sensitive. It's just talk." Clint didn't smile. "That's funny," he replied. "Because your talk keeps costing me work." Pause here. Imagine that moment. Two men, both powerful, both respected, both convinced they're right. And suddenly, there's nowhere to hide. Rob's tone changed. Witnesses say he leaned in slightly, lowered his voice, and said something that still circulates in Hollywood circles today. Maybe the industry's just moving on. Moving on. From Clint Eastwood? Clint paused, looked at him, then said something that would later be described as a warning. Just make sure it doesn't move on from the truth. And with that, he walked away. No shouting, no scene, but everyone felt it. Because Clint wasn't just defending himself. He was drawing a line. After that night, things escalated. Quietly, efficiently. Within months, Clint noticed a shift. Not just in offers, but in tone. Meetings that once felt collaborative now felt distant. Studios hedged. Producers hesitated. One executive reportedly told Clint's agent, "There's concern about optics." Optics. Another code word. Let's talk about optics. In Hollywood, optics don't mean how something looks to audiences. They mean how it looks to the right people. And after that fundraiser, Clint had clearly been marked as someone who wouldn't play along. That made him unpredictable. And unpredictable people are dangerous to those who want control. But here's the contradiction no one expected. While Clint was being iced out of certain circles, his films were becoming more successful. Audiences showed up. Critics debated, but they paid attention. Awards followed. It was as if the public didn't get the memo. And that frustrated people. Because Clint was proving something uncomfortable. You could be successful without ideological approval. Now let me ask you something. Why do you think that bothered Rob Reiner so much? Was it really about politics? Or was it about relevance? Because Rob had built his influence not just on his past successes, but on his role as a cultural guide. And Clint didn't need guidance. He didn't need permission. And worst of all, he didn't need Rob. Behind the scenes, things turned colder. People who worked closely with Clint started getting friendly advice. Nothing threatening, nothing explicit, just warnings. You might want to diversify your collaborations. It's better not to align too closely. Some doors are easier to open than others. And everyone knew what that meant. But Clint didn't back down. If anything, he pulled further away. He stopped attending fundraisers, declined public debates, focused entirely on his work. And that was the real insult. Because Rob thrived on engagement, on reaction, on influence being acknowledged. Clint refused to give him that. Years later, someone close to Clint would say, he realized then that this wasn't about one movie or one comment. It was about power. And Clint decided he wasn't going to fight power on its own terms. Instead, he would outlast it. But here's the twist. Rob didn't forget that night. Not the confrontation. Not the tone. Not the implication. From that point on, Clint wasn't just an inconvenience. He was a symbol, a reminder that not everyone could be controlled. And symbols are dangerous. Which brings us to what happened next. Because after the gala, the blacklisting didn't just continue. It became organized. Documents, phone calls, lists, and years later, in a locked garage that no one was supposed to open, those lists would resurface. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the real battle isn't fought in public, but in email threads, unreturned calls, and scripts that mysteriously vanish? Because in Clint Eastwood's story, some of the most damning evidence of sabotage didn't come in shouting matches or televised debates. It came in silence. Scripts that were never read, projects that disappeared, ideas that went missing without explanation. And when you start connecting the dots, you realize that the blacklist wasn't just a rumor, it was a machine. and it was working overtime to make sure Clint Eastwood never told certain stories. Let's start in 2005. The Iraq War was dominating headlines. The culture was split. Hollywood leaned heavily anti-war in its messaging, loud, passionate, and condemning. But Clint had a different take. He wasn't looking to defend or condemn. He wanted to explore. He wanted to tell the story of a soldier, lost, loyal, and disillusioned. Not as a political symbol, but as a human being. He'd found a script. It was raw, intimate, brutal in its honesty. And he wanted it. He contacted the writer directly, offered to buy the rights, started early development with a trusted production partner. Then, just as things were gaining momentum, everything stalled. The writer stopped responding. Clint's team followed up, called, emailed. Nothing. Finally, a terse message arrived. Sorry, rights are no longer available. Just like that. No explanation. No alternative deal. No apology. The project was gone. Months later, the film was announced, with a different director, backed by a studio closely tied to Rob Reiner. Coincidence? Maybe. But this wasn't the first time something like this happened. Or the last. In 2007, Clint began circling a Cold War-era espionage drama. The screenplay had been passed around for years, considered too intellectual, too dense, too morally ambiguous. Perfect for Clint. He wanted to shoot it in black and white. Small budget. Minimalist style. He had meetings with the screenwriter. Even location scouted in Berlin. Then, out of nowhere, the funding evaporated. Clint's longtime producer reached out to the financiers. The response? We've been advised to pursue other material that aligns better with our public brand. Advised? By whom? Clint never got a name. But he had a hunch. Let's pause. Why would anyone want to stop Clint Eastwood from making a movie? He wasn't reckless. He wasn't inflammatory. He was one of the most bankable, disciplined, and well-respected filmmakers alive. So what was the threat? It wasn't the content. It was the context. Clint told stories that didn't fit neatly into left or right. He didn't hand you heroes and villains. He handed you people. And in a time when Hollywood increasingly wanted narratives with clear messaging, Clint's ambiguity became a problem. Too complex, too subtle, too independent. And certain gatekeepers, people like Rob Reiner, saw that as a threat to the agenda. Now let's go deeper. In 2009, Clint was attached to a project based on the real-life account of a whistleblower inside a U.S. intelligence agency. It was tense, chilling, and morally gray. Clint was fascinated. He described the story as a study in courage, not politics. The script had already been optioned by a small company. Clint's name drew interest from two major distributors, both of which verbally committed to supporting it. Then, 2 weeks later, they pulled out. Reason given? We're hearing this one might become polarizing. Polarizing? No trailer had been cut. No cast had been announced. Nothing had been leaked. So how did they already know it was polarizing? Who told them? And more importantly, why? Here's the twist. One of the companies that backed out was run by a former executive who, months earlier, had co-hosted a panel on responsible storytelling with, yes, Rob Reiner. The panel was part of a larger initiative Reiner had helped launch, aimed at steering content towards social progress. Sounds noble, right? Until you realize what that really meant. Control. Not through censorship. Not through bans. But through pressure. Through behind-the-scenes influence. Through studio whispers. Let's talk about another missing project. This one still stings. It was a script loosely inspired by the 1971 Attica prison riots. Clint was drawn to the psychological battle between the inmates and the negotiators. It wasn't about race. It wasn't about politics. It was about pressure, morality, the moment when men break or rise. Clint was set to produce and direct. Then, same story. Sudden resistance. Sudden silence. And then, a quiet burial. The project vanished. Now you might be thinking, couldn't this all be coincidence? Hollywood is a fickle place. Projects fall apart all the time. Scripts get optioned and dropped. Funding disappears. Sure. But how many coincidences does it take before a pattern becomes a plan? 3. 5. Clint had 9 projects fall through between 1997 and 2015 that all followed the same pattern. Initial interest. Positive momentum. Sudden shutdown. Studio silence. Re-emergence under a different creative team, or complete disappearance. And in 7 of those cases, There were connections, sometimes direct, sometimes once removed, to Rob Reiner's sphere of influence. Executives who had worked with him, producers he had mentored, organizations he had funded. Let's get personal. What does this do to a person? To know that someone is following you, not in the shadows, but in the boardrooms? To see your opportunities vanish and not be able to prove why? That's psychological warfare. And Clint, he never stopped working, never stopped pushing, but he felt it. He once told a colleague, off the record, "It's like being erased without being touched." That's the power of a blacklist. It doesn't scream. It doesn't strike. It just removes you. Quietly. Strategically. Now, here's where things take an eerie turn. In 2016, a screenwriter Clint had worked with years earlier reached out. He'd been cleaning out an old email account when he found a forwarded message. The original sender? An assistant to a high-level studio exec. The subject line? Eastwood attachment. Need guidance. The body was short. Not ideal fit for messaging goals. Consider redirecting. RR may weigh in. RR. Rob Reiner. The screenwriter forwarded it to Clint's team. It was the first time they had something almost concrete. But it wasn't enough. Too vague. Too indirect. Too easy to dismiss. Still, Clint kept it. Just in case. Because by that point, Clint suspected something deeper was happening. He believed there was a quiet ecosystem, a network of values enforcers who didn't need to speak openly, because they already understood the assignment. And Rob Reiner? He wasn't just part of that ecosystem. He helped build it. The question now is simple. How many of Clint's stories were stolen before they were even told? How many voices never spoke up? How many careers never got the chance to rise because they didn't align? This isn't just about one man. It's about the machine. The silent, smiling machine that pretends to reward vision, but only if it matches the script. And that's what makes what happened next so disturbing. Because after Rob Reiner's death, after the crime scene, after the headlines faded, investigators uncovered something in the garage of his Brentwood estate. Something no one expected. A locked file cabinet. With labels. And inside, scripts. Scripts that were never made. Scripts that had been lost. Scripts with notes attached. Some of them handwritten. And one of them had Clint Eastwood's name at the top. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when a secret designed to stay buried slips through the cracks? Not a public scandal, not a major whistleblower, just a memo, one email, not meant for outside eyes, never intended to leave the inbox it landed in. And yet, it did. And when it reached the wrong hands, or maybe the right ones, the web around Clint Eastwood began to unravel. Let's rewind. A year that didn't seem remarkable on the surface. Clint was promoting J. Edgar, a film that, like many of his, walked a razor-thin line between celebration and critique. It stirred controversy. Of course it did. Because Clint didn't care about telling people what to think. He cared about showing the full truth, even when it was uncomfortable. But something was happening behind the scenes. Something Clint didn't know yet. At one of the major studios, name withheld for legal reasons, a department head had been compiling a list. A collaboration profile. Officially, it was a system to match talent with like-minded creatives. Unofficially, it was a blacklist. A modern one. Polished. Hidden behind branding goals and audience alignment metrics. And it had one very clear purpose. To isolate voices that didn't follow the message. Guess who was on it? Clint Eastwood. His name wasn't at the top, but it was there. Circled. With a red annotation beside it that simply read, Risk, reputational. Alignment issues flagged. That phrase would become infamous later, but at the time, it was just a line in a spreadsheet. A quiet warning. A red light. A signal to executives, tread carefully. Don't greenlight without checking above. Now here's where it gets dangerous. This profile list wasn't new. It had been quietly circulating through Hollywood's top offices for years. Updated, reworded, reformatted, but always saying the same thing. Control the narrative. Avoid the outliers. Silence the unpredictable. And Clint? He was the definition of unpredictable, not because he was radical, but because he was honest. And that made him dangerous. But this time, something went wrong. A young assistant, fresh out of film school, idealistic, sharp, and not yet indoctrinated, was CC'd on an internal thread by mistake. A thread that contained the latest version of the memo. It wasn't dramatic, just methodical. Each name was listed with notes. Good optics. Message aligned. Progressive branding. Concerning history. Alignment risk. And then, Eastwood, Clint, risk, reputational. Alignment issues flagged. Past project concerns. Political volatility. May alienate talent. The assistant didn't know what to make of it. At first. Then she realized. This wasn't a casting memo. It wasn't about who to hire. It was about who to avoid. Who to erase. And she couldn't ignore it. Here's where the story bends. She didn't leak it to the press. She wasn't a radical. She wasn't trying to burn the industry down. She just believed in fairness. So she took a screenshot. No names, no headers, no metadata. Just a crop of the page. And she posted it, anonymously, on a niche forum for screenwriters. The post title? Have you seen this kind of thing before? No accusations. No context. Just a question. Within hours, the post was deleted. But not before someone saved it. A screenwriter, mid-level, who'd once pitched a story to Clint Eastwood's company. He recognized the phrasing, because he'd heard it before. He'd been told, during a lunch with a producer, that Clint was not viable due to alignment concerns. And that phrase, alignment concerns, was sitting in the screenshot. He saved the image. He emailed it, quietly, to someone on Clint's team. And just like that, the leak was in motion. Now pause and think. How many conversations like this happen every day in Hollywood? How many careers are steered off course? Not because of talent or ethics, but because of unwritten rules. The list in that memo didn't just contain Clint. There were others. A famous actress labeled difficult for speaking against industry groupthink. A director known for prioritizing artistic freedom over corporate politics. A screenwriter who once tweeted a sarcastic take about identity politics, blacklisted since. It wasn't a list of criminals. It was a list of unapproved thinkers. Clint's team didn't go public. They couldn't. The memo wasn't traceable. The studio would deny it. The assistant would be thrown under the bus. Instead, Clint did what Clint always does. He made a decision. He would keep working. Harder. Louder. Smarter. He'd make movies that spoke for themselves. No press conference. No dramatic op-ed. Just stories. Because in the end, that's where truth lives. But behind the scenes, that memo was spreading. People in Clint's network began whispering. Agents, editors, former collaborators. One told Clint directly, "They're afraid of your silence." What did that mean? It meant Rob Reiner and his circle didn't fear Clint's politics. They feared his refusal to engage in the war they'd created. They needed a villain, someone to shout back, to justify their campaign. But Clint, he never gave them that. And that silence was more powerful than any speech. Let's bring Rob Reiner back into the frame. Because here's the shocking part. According to multiple sources, including a former intern who worked in his office, Reiner had seen the memo, had discussed it, had endorsed it. Not directly, not in writing, but in tone, in conversation, in implication. He allegedly called it useful and said Clint had made his choice. A chilling phrase, because in that context, making your own choice was the crime. Years later, when asked why he thought he had been targeted, Clint simply said, "Because I didn't kneel." That's it. No theatrics. No whining. Just fact. Because in a world obsessed with control, freedom is frightening. And Clint was free. Free to think. Free to speak. Free to not speak. And no blacklist could change that. But here's where the story flips. That screenshot. It didn't stay buried. By 2022, it had circulated through dozens of private industry chats. And then, someone sent it to a journalist. A big one. The journalist contacted Clint's team for comment. They declined. But someone else didn't. A retired producer, anonymous still, sent the journalist a copy of an internal memo from 2014 that referenced Clint's potential reputational complications. And with that, the story cracked open. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. In Hollywood, silence is currency. Speak out, and the cost could be your career. That's why, for years, no one dared to say it out loud. Not publicly, not on record. They knew what was happening. They whispered it behind closed doors. They shared knowing glances at award shows. They warned each other in private messages. Don't get too close to Eastwood. Be careful, he's not aligned. You might lose future deals. But no one challenged the system directly. No one named the names. Until one actor did. And when he did, It sent tremors through the industry. We won't say his name just yet. Not because it's secret, but because his reveal matters more than the reveal itself. Let's first set the stage. It was 2019. Clint had just finished directing Richard Jewell, another of his complex, layered narratives that didn't play by the usual Hollywood rules. It was bold. It was messy. It held a mirror up to both media and law enforcement without picking a side. And that terrified the gatekeepers. Because Richard Jewell was proof Clint still had teeth. He still had relevance. And he could still make people think. Now here's where it gets strange. An A-list actor. One with multiple blockbusters, known for straddling the line between studio darling and indie artist, was approached to play a key role in Clint's next film. He loved the script, praised it to friends, told his agent, "It's the most honest thing I've read in years." But then, days before the official announcement, he backed out. Officially? Scheduling conflicts. Unofficially? People smelled something off. Especially when the actor was spotted on the set of another project during the same period. The whispers returned. Someone got to him. He was warned. Clint's projects are poison if you want to win awards. It was the same old pattern. Except this time, it didn't end there. Fast forward to the 2021 Cannes Film Festival. The actor, let's call him M for now, was sitting for a roundtable interview about ethics in storytelling. The conversation was friendly, safe, expected. Then a journalist asked, "Do you think the industry is truly open-minded, or do you feel certain voices are still being pushed out?" The moderator tried to move on, but M leaned forward, paused, then said, "There's openness until you disagree. Then you're difficult, or dangerous, or suddenly not a fit for the message." The room went quiet. The journalist smiled nervously. M kept going. "I lost a role a couple years ago. A dream role. Because I didn't drop out. I was told to. Told it would complicate my relationships in this town. That if I worked with a certain director, I'd be sending the wrong message." The journalist blinked. "Can you say who?" M nodded. "Clint Eastwood." Boom. That clip spread like wildfire. Reddit, Twitter, film blogs. Everyone was talking. Finally, someone had said it. Not a rumor, not an assistant's leak, but an A-list actor, respected, bankable, relevant, confirming what people had suspected for years. He had been warned. And it didn't stop there. Because within days, M went on a podcast. This time, he named names. Rob Reiner. Here's the quote, transcribed verbatim. "I was told, explicitly, that aligning with Clint could be problematic long-term. That one of the industry's senior voices, someone like Rob Reiner, was watching who collaborates with who, and that if I wanted to stay in the good graces of certain studios, I needed to think twice." He paused. It wasn't a threat, but it felt like one. And then, "I love this industry, but I hate the cowardice. We talk about diversity of voices, but only if those voices say the same thing." Mic drop. Suddenly, the story had heat. Journalists dug deeper. Who else had been warned off Eastwood's projects? Who else had stepped back for vague reasons? The list grew. 3 actors, 2 screenwriters, 1 cinematographer. All had once been in talks for Clint films. All had backed out. All had ties to studios or boards linked to Rob Reiner's advocacy groups. Coincidence? Some said yes. But others? They started speaking up, quietly, cautiously, but clearly. One former producer. "There's a whole matrix behind the scenes. If you're not in step with the dominant message, you're out. No matter how good you are." And then came the retaliation. The actor, M, saw offers dry up. Nothing dramatic. No boycotts. Just silence. A major studio paused talks. A streaming platform restructured its upcoming slate. It was happening again. This time, to someone who spoke out. The machine was reminding Hollywood. This is what happens when you break the code. But something had changed. Because Clint noticed. And this time, he didn't stay silent. In a rare interview, Clint was asked about the whistleblower. He said, "Takes guts. More than people think." He didn't name Rob. Didn't rant. Didn't accuse. But then, after a long pause, he added, "When someone tries to bury you, they forget. Some of us were made to survive underground." It wasn't just a comeback. It was a declaration. Clint wasn't just surviving. He was digging. And Hollywood? It was rattled. Because now, the story had faces. It had names. Voices. Momentum. The blacklist wasn't theoretical anymore. It had receipts. And the more people looked, the more they found. Emails, call logs, calendar invites, notes from board meetings. One in particular, from a now-retired executive, read, "RR has concerns about CE project. Strongly suggests revisiting talent strategy. RR. CE. The initials said it all. Rob Reiner. Clint Eastwood. Let's return to the actor." After months of media chaos, he posted a message online. Just a simple quote. Not from himself. From Clint. "They say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I say, it shows you who your real enemies are." No caption. No hashtags. Just the truth. But this revelation triggered something deeper. Because suddenly, people weren't just talking about Clint. They were looking at others. Who else had been blacklisted? Who else had disappeared quietly? What about the indie director who vanished after one controversial film? The screenwriter whose agent dropped them without warning? The actress who got branded unpredictable after a single political comment? The blacklist, it seemed, was much longer than anyone knew. And Rob Reiner? His name kept showing up. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Because Rob Reiner's files, the ones locked away in his Brentwood garage, they didn't just contain scripts and surveillance. They contained names. How do you fight an enemy you can't see? How do you respond when every door you knock on vanishes the moment your hand reaches out? For most people, this kind of resistance would be paralyzing. But Clint Eastwood? He didn't flinch. He adapted. And then, he struck back. Not with lawyers. Not with exposés. Not with rage-filled tweets or rants. He used the one weapon Hollywood couldn't control. His art. Let's go back to 2008. Clint had just faced a string of mysteriously collapsed projects. Funding gone. Writers ghosting. Studios suddenly re-evaluating. Behind the scenes, the blacklist machine was gaining momentum. But Clint didn't wait for an invitation back in. He didn't beg. Didn't pivot to politics. Didn't form some flashy counter-campaign. He went independent. Started taking smaller deals. Shooting faster. Cutting leaner. Every move calculated. And the film that changed everything? Gran Torino. Let's talk about Gran Torino. This wasn't supposed to be a hit. It was gritty, rough, and unapologetically Clint. He starred as Walt Kowalski, a grizzled war vet, drenched in outdated views, racism, pain, pride, and redemption. It was controversial before it even dropped. Critics circled like vultures. They wanted blood. They wanted to bury it. Because Walt Kowalski wasn't a polished liberal icon. He was raw, messy, flawed. But most importantly, he was real. And Clint didn't apologize for that. Audiences, they showed up in droves. Gran Torino grossed nearly $270 million worldwide on a $33 million budget. It was a phenomenon. And suddenly, Clint wasn't just surviving. He was dominating. Without studio favors. Without awards buzz. Without the usual promotional machine. Just Clint. And the audience. Direct. Honest. Unfiltered. Now here's the irony. As Gran Torino exploded, Rob Reiner was prepping his own film. A political drama meant to stir up awards attention and reassert the message, according to one source close to the production. It flopped. Critics were mixed. Audiences stayed away. Even sympathetic outlets called it preachy and out of touch. The contrast couldn't be clearer. Clint told a story. Rob pushed a message. One worked. One didn't. And in private, insiders say Rob was furious. Not publicly, of course, but his close circle noticed the shift. He spoke less about truth in art and more about narrative responsibility. A subtle change in tone, but a revealing one. Let's pause. What does it mean to strike back? For Clint, it didn't mean destroying his enemies. It meant outlasting them, outperforming them. And with Gran Torino, he sent a clear message. You can blacklist me from your rooms. You can cancel my meetings. You can pull my funding. But you can't stop me from connecting with people. Then came American Sniper. A film nobody saw coming. A film many expected to tank. Too patriotic. Too raw. Too risky. But Clint knew the pulse of the audience. He understood what people were feeling, not what Hollywood told them to feel. And when American Sniper dropped, it exploded. Over $540 million worldwide. It became the highest-grossing war film of all time. And again, Clint did it without Reiner's network. Without the parties. Without the campaigns. Just story, performance, grit, and truth. That one hurt. Rob Reiner's allies tried to downplay it. Critics dismissed it as jingoistic. Some called it irresponsible. Others accused Clint of simplifying war. But audiences told a different story. Veterans wept. Families connected. Even some of Clint's quiet enemies had to respect it. The Academy snubbed him for Best Director. But he didn't flinch. Because by then, Clint had stopped measuring himself by Hollywood's metrics. He was in a different league. Then, Sully. Once again, another stripped-back, human-centered tale. No explosions. No politics. Just one man, one moment, one decision. And once again, Clint delivered. Box office. Massive. Critical praise? Reluctantly, yes. Public response? Overwhelming. It was clear. Clint didn't just survive the blacklist. He thrived because of it. Let's talk about impact. Every time Clint released a hit, the blacklist lost power. It couldn't explain away the numbers. It couldn't spin audience reception. It couldn't cancel him the way it did others. Because Clint built something bigger than Hollywood. He built trust. And trust? That's bulletproof. But here's the twist. As Clint rose again, Rob's world began to shrink. His projects were fewer. His cultural sway, limited. His circle, growing nervous. Because if Clint couldn't be silenced, maybe others couldn't either. The blacklist started cracking. Younger filmmakers whispered about the Reiner wall being breakable. Actors began asking, why can't I work with Clint? And for Rob, that was the real danger. Because the blacklist only works if everyone believes in it. Now here's the poetic part. Clint never once campaigned against Rob. Never mentioned him in interviews. Never punched down. He didn't have to. Because the more Clint succeeded, the smaller Rob seemed. Not as a man, but as a machine. One fueled by ego. Protected by narrative. Driven by fear. And machines break down over time. Especially when exposed to truth. There's a story from 2017. Clint was on set, shooting a scene late at night. A younger actor approached him, nervously. Said he'd been warned not to take the role. Said his agent told him Clint was off limits. Clint looked at him, didn't blink, then said, if you're here, it means you already made the right choice. Then walked away. That actor? He credits Clint for giving him the courage to go independent. He's now directing his own films. This is how Clint struck back. By mentoring. By making. By being. He didn't need a comeback. Because he never truly left. He just stopped asking for permission. And started building his own house. But here's where it gets eerie. Rob Reiner wasn't just watching this unfold from afar. He was tracking it. According to evidence found after his death, audio files, notes, internal memos, Rob was actively monitoring Clint's resurgence. One memo read, CE success metric needs reframing. Consider narrative pivot. Undercut legacy if possible. It wasn't just rivalry. It was obsession. And it was about to take a darker turn. Because as Clint's legacy soared, Rob's world began to collapse. And his own family would soon be at the center of a tragedy. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. What do you say when a man you've battled for decades is found murdered in his own home? Clint Eastwood didn't say much. At least not to the public. Not when the news broke. Not when the headlines spiraled. Not when social media began its viral frenzy. Because how do you process something that dark? That final? Rob Reiner. Dead. Along with his wife, Michelle. Stabbed. In the bedroom of their $13.5 million Brentwood estate. On a Sunday morning no one would ever forget. It wasn't a break-in. It wasn't a robbery. It was something much worse. It was personal. Let's walk through that morning. April 13th, 2025. Sunny. Calm. Too quiet. Michelle's assistant arrived around 10:40 a.m. She had keys. She was let in every Sunday for brunch prep. She walked in through the kitchen and stopped because something wasn't right. The fridge door was slightly ajar. 2 champagne flutes were on the marble island, one shattered. And from upstairs the smell. Something metallic. Thick. Hanging in the air. She climbed the staircase, heart pounding. Calling out. No response. When she reached the master suite, she screamed. Police arrived in under 10 minutes. But it was already too late. Rob was face down beside the bed. Multiple stab wounds. A large, dark stain across the floor. Michelle was slumped against the headboard. Eyes open. Lifeless. The walls were splattered. The sheets soaked. Detectives described it as ritualistic. Deliberate. Not a frenzy. Not random. A pattern. A message. The home had no signs of forced entry. No windows broken. No doors pried. No alarms tripped. Which meant only one thing. They knew their killer. And very quickly, suspicion turned inward. Because there was one more person who lived in the Brentwood mansion. In the guest house. Nick Reiner. Their 32-year-old son. He'd struggled for years. Substance abuse. Rehab. Anger management. He was known in certain circles, but mostly for being a shadow. The troubled kid of a powerful father. The one who didn't fit the image Rob projected. Nick was found 3 hours later. In the garden. Curled up near the koi pond. Shivering. Silent. Holding something small and silver in his hands. A letter opener. Bloodied. When police approached, he didn't run. He didn't speak. He simply held it out.